Well, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce to you Professor Brian Castellani, who also happens to be my PhD supervisor. He's trained as a sociologist, a clinical psychologist, and a methodologist in both statistics and computational social sciences. Brian has spent the last 10 years developing a new case-based data mining approach to modeling complex social systems called SACS Toolkit. He and his colleagues have used this to help researchers, policymakers, and service providers address and improve complex public health issues, such as community health and well-being, infrastructure and grid reliability, mental health and inequality, big data and data mining, and globalization and global civil society. So a big gambit there. He's also been recently involved in developing what's known as the Complex at R Studio software app, which allows everyday users seamless access to such high-powered techniques as machine learning and intelligence, neural nets, and agent-based modeling to make better sense of our complex world. So today, for his talk, Brian will provide us with a quick summary of the work scholars have done over the last 8 decades in developing a psychology of complexity, and in turn, how this will help us understand the challenges civil society faces in our current globalized era. Everything from Brexit through to nationalism. I imagine we'll talk about the Trump era a little bit in that context as well, to issues regarding public health and our current global response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So a big thank you, Brian. We look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Anton, and thank you, Andrew, for the opportunity. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Tell me if you can see that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So thanks for the opportunity to talk today. What I wanted to do, as Anton said, was to talk about the psychology of complexity and ultimately its role in global civil society. The way I'll do that is first to take a brief history, as Anton said, about the relationship between this discipline we call psychology and this area of study we call complexity, and then to think about 2 examples to demonstrate the value of this approach. So we'll just sort of jump in with the history to begin. And as I said, I'll talk about 40 minutes at the most and open it up to questions. What's interesting is that the psychology of complexity has been present in the field going all the way back to Gestalt and the early Macy Conferences around complexity and cybernetics. But despite the fact that it's been there, it's never really stood out amongst the work that complexity scientists have done. So part of what I've been quite interested in over the past 2 years, in particular 2-3 years, is trying to catalog that history, which you can see here in very quick sketch and outline. This is the new version of the map of the complexity sciences for those who have been potentially not familiar with it. You can see it online. We'll be launching this new version summer 2021 with particular emphasis now on putting psychological systems theory and the complexity in psychology in there, as well as developing up related fields like cognitive science and linguistics, semiotics, and so forth. So this is new to the map. And it was really something that I was slow to bring until I really had time to sort of archive the history. So I just want to sort of walk through that and make 2 very important points. I want to talk about first the early years and this issue of the psychology of complexity, and then the shift eventually to the complexity of psychology. And what I mean by the psychology of complexity, what I mean is that psychologists, people actually involved in the discipline of psychology, were actually using the tools of the trade to gain insights into the complexity of the human experience, as opposed to the latter, which is this idea that around the emergence of the Santa Fe Institute in the 80s, where complexity suddenly became in vogue, suddenly it was the application of the concepts of complexity to psychology. which is a very different, albeit subtle distinction that I hope to draw out a bit as we go on. So probably the earliest formation would be the Gestalt work. And in here, we actually see the complexity of psychology, or psychology of complexity, being developed in concepts like emergence, closure issues, where the mind finishes off objects, similarity, reification issues, continuity, and so forth. So these are actual explorations of how psychology makes sense of the complexity of our human brains. And then what's also fascinating when you dig into the archives, which I've always enjoyed doing, going back to graduate school days, is to find people that 50, 60, 80, 100, 200 years ago, or perhaps even longer, were writing about the very ideas that seem new or innovative now. So for those of you who are familiar with field theory and the work of Kurt Lewin, and this idea of vector psychology and looking at the relationships between or amongst people, and how that forms identity and self and purpose and drive and so forth. And that, to remind ourselves that Lewin, was one of the first people to develop the field of social psych, group dynamics, action research, organizational development. And then you get to the Macy Conferences. This is probably, for most historians, the point at which systems thinking and complexity formally starts. And as you look at the list of names here, the participants, it's massively impressive. From Margaret Mead to Gregory Bateson to John von Neumann and others, it's an incredible group of people that were at those conferences. And to think of the fields that came out of that, the ecology of mind, which would develop into embodied mind literature and all the related work around family systems theory, to cybernetics and the development of artificial intelligence. And as well to then think about the emerging field of cognitive science, which in many ways is a transdisciplinary, or at least minimally a multidisciplinary field of study, from linguistics to computer science. As you move, though, into the 1980s, 1990s, we see this switch that I was talking about, which is now moving from a psychology of complexity to a complexity of psychology. And an excellent example of that is the work of Thatcher and colleagues with Herman Hacken, who's actually still alive and doing research, which is just absolutely brilliant, around taking this concept of synergetics and applying it to issues in clinical psychology. Synergetics, basically, in a nutshell, is looking for macroscopic properties and arrangements to understand how systems evolve across time, looking at multiple trajectories and their intersection and how that results in the self-organization of systems and their movement across time. And then the other area that emerged that I saw in the literature, which was this change in psychotherapy. My background is, as Anton mentioned, I'm trained as a clinical psychologist and worked for 10 years as a clinician, and the complex dynamics of the therapeutic process and how people change across time and how that change is sustained and how people manage that, moving from one state and crossing a tipping point and moving to another, or perhaps not, and then managing themselves. So the work of Gustafson around brief psychotherapy and Adele Hayes and others, again, looking at how do you initiate change in a system, in this case, the psychology of somebody, to move them on a path of healing or management. The most recent work is being done at the University of Amsterdam. Colleagues Denny Boersboom and Angelique Kramer and others, Han van der Maas. What they are doing is taking a lot of the work that's been done around the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders and applying network theory concepts. So you see over here, taking a diagnosis like depression and anxiety and looking at actually the symptomology across them and how they actually intersect, and sort of trying to understand how symptoms cross different diagnoses. One of the things that always impressed itself upon me when I was actually doing diagnosis in work was the extent to which the DSM and other psychiatric diagnostic nomenclatures go to treat diagnostic categories as if they were orthogonal or somehow separate, when in reality we know that they're not, that they are densely overlapped and connected. And while you do have emergent patterns in, say, schizophrenia as opposed to, say, depression, the symptomology relationships amongst clusters is not as distinct. Then there's the field of computational social psychology, which has emerged primarily in the States through the work of Robin Valisher and Andres Noack. This is really taking the larger field of computational science and applying it to topics within social psychology. This is less novel as compared to some of the others, but this would be a very good example of applying complexity to psychology. And in this case, you know, doing agent-based modeling or different types of differential equation modeling. And then the last area would be chaos and complexity in psychology. And here again, trying to look at fractal patterns, tipping points, bifurcation, all these sorts of complexity terms. There is a limit in the degree to which this sort of work is useful. One of the concerns that I always have as a person who formerly was a practicing clinician is that's an interesting new concept, but does it tell me anything different about what I actually do with people that I work with? And this would be an example of the benefits that come from changing terminology might not be as great as, say, other fields. So that just gives you a very quick sense of sort of the different areas within the psychology of complexity. And you can see there's a lot that's been done, but in a lot of ways, there is a lot that has not been developed. And there are diminishing returns on just the straight application of complexity to psychology. The work that I'm doing right now with my colleague Lasse Gerrits at the University of Rotterdam is we're writing a new book called The Atlas of Social Complexity. And one of the things that we're noticing in, we've interviewed now roughly 50 people in the field, and really talking to people that are at the leading edge, not necessarily the people that already pioneered the ideas, but more the people that are innovating now. And one of the things that they consistently said in interviews was, well, I'm not a complexity scientist. I don't see myself as a systems theorist. And it was interesting because they saw themselves as outside the boundaries of the field. But what was interesting to us is we did a bit of a pushback and said, well, actually looking at the work, what we see is bringing the social sciences back to complexity. So if you sort of think about the beginning, there's a sort of rapprochement here where you had the psychology of complexity, then the complexity of psychology, and now a bit of a turn back to the psychology of complexity. What I want to talk about next then is sort of one example of where this has impacted research, which is around this issue of cognition and consciousness in the human. If you go back to Freud and Jung as easy markers for sort of thinking about the unconscious, not necessarily that they invented the idea, but certainly they brought it to wide public attention. The idea that our conscious self was not the be all and end all of how we operate as human beings, and to think how sort of world shattering that idea was. But if you turn now to the work that's being done across the fields, what you see is this area that I've bracketed here is really the sort of traditional sort of focus of the reflexive self, consciousness, pre-consciousness, and unconsciousness. But in reality, we now have research that demonstrates cognition and consciousness across the entire spectrum of our human existence. I just want to walk briefly through that just as demonstration of these ideas. Again, my goal here today, given this is a seminar series, is really to sketch some of these ideas rather than to delve in depth into them. But again, to demonstrate in a very empirically rigorous manner that these ideas are in application, and this entirety of our conscious experience is something that hasn't been stitched quite together yet, but sits there waiting to be done so. An easy example is back in the early aughts, the work of Eshel Ben Jacob, who unfortunately passed away early, was exploring this idea of bacterial communication and social intelligence. And during those early years when I was putting these sorts of things together and lecturing at medical school, my biology colleagues were just, what are you talking about? But now we see, you know, some 20 years on with quorum sensing amongst bacterial and viral organisms and this idea of how they're communicating chemically, suddenly this idea has gone from something that perhaps was more in the realm of science fiction to the whole probiotic and movement, as opposed to the antibiotic movement in science and in medicine. And it's making major strides in terms of how we think about bacteria, good bacteria and bad bacteria, and how, you know, using Purell or different types of antibacterial on your hands is not any good. It's actually killing the good bacteria as well as the bad. And then again, another example of the work of Maturana and Varela, and Umberto Maturana just passed away as well recently, but their work around autopoiesis and the idea of cellular organization. And here we have an example of a cell going through mitosis. This idea of cells having an inside and an outside, therefore this capacity to designate between what it is, self, and the external medium or environment in which it's situated, albeit a very primitive notion of cognition. Nonetheless, it is this idea of this living organism having a sense of where it begins and where something else ends. And it's interesting how that sort of work, these sorts of ideas are very much connected to the vaccines that have been recently developed around messenger RNA and the way in which cells communicate with each other and send each other messages, which had been a previously sort of, you know, again, very unknown or undeveloped area of science. Then we start getting into other areas that, again, oftentimes sit outside traditional psychology, or the way we think about the way the body works, is to talk about gut-brain micro communication, this idea of what is happening in our stomachs in relationship to what is happening in our minds. And a lot of this work plays out across inflammatory disorders and thinking about the relationship between what we eat, how we digest, how we go about existing with our bacteria, and the relationship between that and different states of emotional states. And that gets to, as well, to the immune system. And these are just some really interesting articles that have come out lately. And this is worth just sort of walking through just quickly, this idea of the immune system, again, and immune system cognition. And here we're talking about not the passive immune system, but the active immune system. And I thought this was a very nice summary. So just a quick sort of, infections cause people to become sick and change their behavior, right? So as I explain to my friends a lot, you know, when I feel sick, I explain to them that's actually the body's reaction to what's inside. The shaking, the wanting to sleep, the feeling ill, the need to stop, pain, fatigue, these are all bodily responses to the external infection, viral or bacterial, coming in. And that the idea that sickness is as normal to infections as the fear response is to a threatening predator. It's a purpose to promote the survival of the organism. If infections do not resolve and peripheral inflammation continues unabated, clinical depression, as an example, can develop over a background of sickness behavior. And so this idea of the mechanism for inflation-associated depression, so forth, in terms of its actual biochemistry, is legitimate. And we see this also in the work that my colleagues and I do around allostatic load, which is a measure of wear and tear on the body. And that can be through acute, massive stress, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, or long-term chronic stress, such as suffering through poverty. And so you see these long-term impacts on the emotional well-being of people as the immune system is struggling to manage that. And again, also the work that I'm doing right now on ambient air pollution and its impact on cognitive brain health across the life course, and looking at how neuroinflammation wears down the blood-brain barrier, and through that process allows ambient air particles into the brain to cause Alzheimer's and depression, or on dementia and stroke and Parkinson's and so forth. Then you get into the field of cognitive science and all of its various levels of learning, which again, this is probably, my daughter right now is majoring in psychology here at York University in the UK. And, you know, cognitive psychology is the core of the three-year program. And so massive advances in this field. And then we move to the work of Panksepp and colleagues in neuroevolutionary origins of human emotions. And here we're dealing with looking at how our paleomammalian past manages or sits as a foundational structure to a lot of the emotional states we experience as humans, from pleasure to arousal to dominance, and then the way in which these emotional states become more sophisticated over time. But certainly that this core as mammals is there sitting in our brains, and the impact that that has on how we manage our world. I'm always impressed that, you know, we look at science fiction and we're 2,000 years into the future and people are still engaging in war, still the same sort of human drama that we see as humans on this planet. Then you move to the work of Lakoff and Johnson, and then Varela, Thompson, and Roche around the embodied experience. I don't know, I'm sure most of you have read The Metaphors We Live By. It's one of the books that just absolutely changed the way I understood the world. The idea that, well, we're moving forward on this. I was stabbed in the back. I feel that all my friends are to the right of me. There's nowhere to go but uphill. In other words, this idea that how we think, how we actually embody our existence is a function of being in bodies and being in places, and how that informs our experience, that we feel when we sit here as conscious beings, as you're listening to me through this medium, that, you know, your sense of who you are as you listen, it sits in your head. It doesn't reside in your knees or your hands. That's a function of the fact that our brains sit there, and how we experience the back of ourselves, the front of ourselves, and all the work that neuroscience has done around brain damage and brain disorders, and the way in which that has revealed to us how vision works, hearing works, and so forth, and the fact that we are, as conscious beings, embodied conscious beings. And then finally, we get to the level of the collective unconscious and the work of Freud and Jung. And again, the collective unconscious, that are, again, nothing so mysterious as the fact that we all have roughly the same sorts of brains that are structured in similar ways. And so therefore, these sorts of archetypes that we experience are consistent. And we see this in fields like structural anthropology and obviously post-structural work along Foucault and others, which actually then moves us up. There's a certain point at which our understanding of cognition and consciousness has to be decentered onto the societies in which we live. It's not just being embodied individuals, but embodied individuals living in groups. And sociobiology and evolutionary psychology, evolutionary biology, and anthropology have gone a long way toward this, as have the fields of sociology and social psychology. And we get in the classic work of George Herbert Mead, for example, in the I and the me, and then the work more recently of Anthony Giddens around self-identity, and the work around emotional labor, and then the work of Foucault around technologies and practices of the self, and the way in which our self is shaped as a function of the different situations that we are positioned in, the networks, the social groups, the societies, the civilizations, and so forth. And this moves us up then to collective intelligence. This has been a very fascinating sort of area of study that I've been quite interested in over the past, I'd say past 3 years, is this idea of Randall Collins, an American sociologist, said, social systems are probably not that sophisticated. That actually we have this idea sort of as we move up in complexity, things get more sophisticated. But if you look at the communication, if you take let's take a traffic jam, it's actually not, even though it's got a bunch of humans in cars that are now stuck in traffic, it's actually a rather unsophisticated system. Nobody's really managing it. And even though you have these highly intelligent individuals sitting in cars, the traffic jam itself is not particularly sophisticated. So one of the things that has been missing in a lot of complexity science is command and control, this notion of governance. How does collective intelligence emerge, and how is it managed? And so when we're thinking about collective intelligence, we're looking for this fact that it may not be as simple as we have with, say, a tree or a stream, where we say, well, they are bottom-up processes, they self-organize, they emerge out of bottom-up agent-based behavior and become these macroscopic emergent structures. When it comes to societies and social, that's just not the case. Social systems have to be regulated. Rules have to be formed. People have to follow the rules of the game, so to speak, and somebody or some things need to be in charge. Now, that doesn't mean it has to be hierarchical. There's all sorts of different types of governance structures which can be explored, and some are more healthier than others. We have structures that lead to domination, exploitation, discrimination. We have other structures that are more healthy and therapeutic and pastoral in their approach. But nonetheless, this idea of managing issues of power, which again, Foucault talks about, and intersectionality theory talks about, these ideas of thinking about social structures as much more complex than these sort of simplified notions of self-organization that we find in the natural sciences. And then finally, we get to, if anybody hasn't read a brilliant book by Catherine Hales, The Power of the Cognitive Non-Conscious, this idea now that we have decentered so much of our lives, including what we're doing right now on Zoom, onto the emergent technology. I'm presently preparing a lecture on the current pandemic and its links to society. And I think more so than the pandemic, certainly COVID-19 will have changed certain things, our realization that we need to pay better attention to, for example, infectious disease, and certainly put that back on the map in terms of public health. But really, I think the ultimate thing that changed over the past year and a half was technology, and the way in which technology led to the vaccination, the way in technology led to the capacity for people to communicate with one another, technology for the management and movement of goods and resources, and the massive inequalities globally that have emerged around that, as we see in terms of distributing the vaccination right now, and global equity and issues around global civil society, and making sure that people are taken care of at a global level. Catherine Hales gets into this work in terms of the idea that so much of our lives now sit on these large databases that exist around us, right? I couldn't tell you just about anybody's phone number other than my own presently, because I don't memorize them anymore. Just simple things like that. Whenever I want to know something, I just look it up. And so the way in which, not so much that we've become cyborgs, but this is a bit more global in its a way in which these non-conscious processes have intersected or integrated into our existence. And then finally, we get out to Gaia theory and the idea of ecological cognition and post-humanism, and this idea of decentering everything that we just talked about onto these larger ecological systems in which we live. This idea that even when you're in your house or you're in whatever dwelling you live in, you're never away from or outside of the environment. You don't go outside to take a walk. You're always in the outside. And this idea of houses and homes. And it's kind of interesting if you go all the way back to shellfish and early crustaceans, and this idea of a home or a chamber always existing in all of the sort of phylogenetic tree of life, and the idea of holes in the ground, or all the different ways in which organisms live in their environments. But then also that combined intelligence. A really interesting article that I had read was about how the birds that live around you know your comings and goings better than your neighbors. That birds are paying attention to when we wake up, when we go outside and do the things we do, and so forth, and that we really are living with the world rather than apart from it. The last thing I want to do is give it a second example, which is specifically to this issue of collective psychology, as a way of pulling out the stuff that I've been talking about and focusing on one particular area. This is based on a previous book that I published, The Defiance of Global Commitment, and then the current book that I'm working on, Western Civilization's Global Discontents, which is a more refined focus just on Western countries in the global North. What held my attention in this book, and another way of demonstrating doing the psychology of complexity as opposed to the other way around, was I've been massively interested in this notion of how the collective psychologies of the world What are they? How did they emerge? And as Anton, alluded to, from Brexit to Trump and what was going on in the United States, to the rise of the alt-right across Europe, and so forth, that when we think about what is going on today, you see that there's been a number of books and articles and newspaper articles written on this idea of suddenly we're paying much more attention to the psychology of people, and sociology, less on macroscopic structures per se, but really trying to understand what is motivating people, which goes to the heart of Anton's research on motivated reasoning as one example of this sort of thinking. So in my work, what I was interested was sort of cataloging, first of all, these collective psychologies to get a feel for them, and then their conflicted relationships with each other, and how they clash. So around issues of racism in the States and Black Lives Matter, what particular collective psychologies were supporting the protests against police violence, and as compared to those that were supporting the police, and why, and what was the reasoning behind this? What was the sort of patterns of communication, and sort of how did these emerge into these collective psychologies, and this relational aspect of them? And then exploring the role that globalization and global civil society have on these collective psychologies. There's been an unfortunate conflation between the notion of globalization as a historical shift in how the world lives in relationship to each other around transportation, goods and services, and cyber infrastructure, and international politics, and cultural sharing across social media, and so forth, versus global civil society, which things like the United Nations and other collective non-governmental organizations, and also just international politics, and this idea of the global civil society around how best should we live in a world where global warming is taking place? How do we live locally in relationship to that? How do we deal with immigration and racism and discrimination against women or LGBT plus communities, and so forth? These sorts of issues that we are dealing with as a world society. And then understand how these conflicted negotiations impact the global social problems we're up against. And again, this notion of developing a psychology of complexity. So I want to sort of challenge this by going to the sort of traditional definition of collective psychology. Collective psychology, this is from the American Psychological Association Dictionary of Psychology, says, the mental and emotional states and processes characteristic of individuals. So notice the highly individualistic orientation of this definition when aggregated up. So it's nothing more than aggregating that up. For me, that definition is highly problematic. Being trained as both a psychologist and a sociologist, I'm much more interested in the intersection of these ideas. So when we think about that cross-section of cognition and consciousness that I outlined from Bacterial up to cybernetic, this idea, the alternative definition that I offer and that I've been working on is this idea of collective psychology being a shared psychology involving similar thoughts, emotions, opinions, concerns, grievances, and beliefs that exist within and across a group of people. So it's within particular individuals, but also across those individuals within that particular group. And the ideology is both internal to the psychology of the individuals. This is something that Anton is exploring in his research, but also external to the psychology of individuals onto the wider social systems of which they are a part. You see this, for example, in the States around working class resentment and the backlash against elites, for example. And this way in which the social groupings that people are situated within also have their own psychology, which emerges across, the communication networks. And that's the idea here, that it's not just top down or bottom up, but it is therefore both. And that it comes through these communication networks. We talk a lot now about Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and all the other different global forms of communication that are used. the way in which people silo their discussions. You can learn a lot about people based on the news sources that they use, and then who they're talking with in those relationships and linkages. So the key here for me is that collective psychologies are fundamentally relational, and that relation is both within groups and between groups. And so you have this notion of defiance and its intersection with power, and that this defiance can be unhealthy, as in anti-vaccination issues, or denying global climate change, or denying racism, or denying discrimination, or it can be healthy defiance, as in resisting patriarchal systems that continue to reinforce and advance domestic violence, or the discrimination against minorities. And then there are therapeutic forms of power, and then there are non-therapeutic forms of power as well. And then the idea that this is situated within a larger system, that you take these relations of power and the psychology around them and situate them onto these larger social groupings in which people are living. To make that very concrete, and again, to promote Anton's work, for example, which I am very excited to see develop, I think he's onto something very important, is this was a New York Times article on just the 18th of May, 2021, looking at, in the United States, the 4 different groups that are most resistant to getting the vaccination. And what's interesting was the New York Times article, which you can look at, actually talked about them in terms of profiles, exactly what my Defiance of Global Commitment book was doing. So this seems to be something that has caught on, in the sense of people starting to think this way. And this idea that 8% are what you would call a psychology of watchfulness, waiting to see what happens next, sort of the bandwagon effect that we talked about in cognitive psychology. If things progress, if the vaccination works. And we see this a lot when we do innovation in social networks as well, where you have doctors that will initially, GPs that will initially use the new ideas, the new media, the new technology, the new medicine, and then other physicians that'll wait. Then you have the cost anxious. They want the vaccine but can't afford the time or cost. System distrusters, and then COVID skeptics. So again, you know, getting into how would you then intervene? So for me, ultimately, again, going back to my background as a clinical psychologist and bringing this discussion here to a close here in a second, is my work also in public health is ultimately how do you address these issues? And certainly condescending attitudes towards anybody never really works. It's the idea of trying to get into headspace of people and help them to move into places that are more healthy, to deal with the resistance, to understand what the resistance is, and then to sort of figure how do you respond to that. And we can see these collective psychologies, as I've mentioned, around Brexit, global warming, refugees and immigrants, the rise of the alt-right movement, the women, protecting women's rights and domestic violence, dealing with that, which we've seen has been a major issue during lockdown and COVID. And then advancing the rights of LGBT plus communities, and then issues around global capitalism. So again, my goal here was to just give you a quick overview of the psychology of complexity in terms of its brief history, an example of the levels of consciousness and cognition that have emerged in the complex system that arises, and then an example of how I've done this research in my own work. So with that, I'll say thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. That was incredibly comprehensive. You shared a lifetime's worth of research with us in a very, very short amount of time. Andrea,
right?
Yeah, just a couple of things. Andrea has a question. Andrea, would you just rather come online and ask your question?
I'll unmute and start. Sorry, I didn't in there first. I was hoping that I'll give other people the space by chattering on a bit to kind of gather their thoughts. It was enormous presentation, very difficult to kind of engage with because it's so big, I think. But one of the things that kind of struck me in the beginning was this idea that you said, or your question, I thought that was really of how to initiate change in a complex system that you call human. And my immediate thought was, well, it can't be cognitive, it'll have to be an emotional change. That's the bottom level basis. And then I was kind of surprised that your whole kind of, in a way, your historical account of what is happening in the relationship between complexity and psychology is almost wholly cognitive. And there's a little bit of, and yeah, there's this emotional stuff at the end. So I was kind of curious about that. How would you respond to that seemingly kind of gap in the theory, if there is? Maybe it's just your own interests.
No, it's an excellent question. Actually, in the Defiance book, that's what I mainly focus on is emotion. I was just sort of giving the cognition one as just one example of sort of, you know, how things go together. But I absolutely agree with you. I mean, I think that if you take a look, for example, at so much of the resistance, right, around global warming, around lots of these issues, it's fueled by anger, it's fueled by frustration, it's fueled by fear. You saw the way President Trump, for example, was so good at stoking the flames, and then how that leads to increasing racist sort of dialogue, and you know, the anger that you just saw people. And that was the reason. So I really appreciate you asking this question, because that's why a lot of people have reacted to the fact that basically what I did with the Defiance of Global Commitment was I reread Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents, and read it chapter by chapter, and then updated it for, you know, our world. A lot of my colleagues I found in psychology, to just even in sociology, they've just been absolutely resistant to it, because it's dealing with the irrational, it's dealing with the emotional, it's dealing with the blood and guts of us as human beings. And this is something I see. So I apologize for that not coming through, because I actually see this is the problem I see with contemporary psychology, is it's forgotten a lot of this. It's so focused on cognition and cognitive processes, and the human being in there, you know, that is absolutely missing. So I agree with you. I think that until we start paying attention to animosities and also trauma, right? When you look at globally, the way in which communities have been traumatized, right? We look at what's happening around the world, that the trauma that communities suffer, and the lack of work that's been done around that, the stewardship, the lack of political stewardship around helping communities out of that trauma, and the emotional consequences that come from that is massive. So I absolutely agree with you. And again, I think it's just more of a fact that I was flying at 100 miles an hour.
Okay, so, great. Yeah. Yes, thanks very much. This is a wonderful presentation, even at 100 miles an hour. So thank you.
Good. I see, Durante, you've got your hand up. Would you like to ask a question? Oh.
Sorry, just taking a few minutes to unmute and do all those things. Thank you. That was quite a scope of presentation. Very difficult for one individual to span all of that. One of the things that I came into the presentation, and I must admit I had a bit of a preconception about, there's something that's on my mind at the moment of personal interest, but I saw you touched on the, and I know your presentation is titled The Psychology of Complexity. So you were looking at the gut link to inflammation, and you touched on its impact on mental health. And, you know, that's been one of the things that's been really important for me, the role of food security and nutrition security and its impact on our current state in the West via these paths. And you've touched on one of those, and perhaps you have some thoughts on that, because normal cognitive psychology has a number of distinct fields, but nutrition and microbacteria or gut bacteria is not one of those things that fits in there traditionally, if you look at how it's defined currently. But I think this is one of the major parts that's neglected, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this and the role of food security. And then, of course, obviously, food security links in very much into the ecological and the impact on the ecological, and that Lancet study on food security and nutrition.
Yeah, excellent questions. And again, I apologize for the 100 miles an hour, but I was sort of thinking, since Anton and Andrea had said this would be recorded, it could just be out there, like, you know, so you could kind of re-listen to it, and again, just to sort of, you know, give that impression. But to your point, Duarte, absolutely 110%. It's funny because my father-in-law, he was a school teacher, and he worked with young people who had a lot of behavioral issues. And this goes back 40 years, right? And he kept focusing on what they were eating, the nutrition, because a lot of these kids were coming from urban inner city environments and so forth. And so the typical sorts of things were focused on parenting and the local communities they were living in, and sociological theories of disorganization and all this sort of stuff. But he focused on what they were eating. And this is before ADHD and, you know, all these sorts of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder issues and stuff. And it always impressed itself upon me as we move across and thinking about how we as humans are what we eat, and food security being a massive issue around the capacity to access food and access healthy food, and 100% the relationship between how that then informs the psychology of people, again, based on how they eat. You see in the West, for example, high-fat diets, and then people, linkages with depression and insomnia and ulcers and all sorts of emotional issues, capacity to think, right? If people are eating high-fat diets, and that's leading to sort of the stomach and the system trying to digest, overworking, people get tired, their cognitive reflexes aren't as good, they want to go take a nap, they can't think through the middle of the afternoon, right? We think about all that sort of stuff. And then larger to the wider food security issues, which then takes it up to a political issue. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think you are 100% right.
Very good. Are there any other questions? Okay. While some of you are formulating questions, I'll maybe shoot one at you, Brian.
Anton, sorry to interrupt you. There's, do you have access to the chat? Because there are questions.
Oh, say another one. Sorry, Gary sent in a question. Oh, there's a few. Sorry, my apologies. I didn't see it. Actually, Bruce, would you like to come on and ask your question?
Sure. Thanks very much. What a really great overview. Thanks so much for that. You know, what I was struck by as I was listening to you run through examples where complexity has given accounts of the physical and psychological and social worlds, is that in every case, it's pushing back against other kinds of accounts. So, you know, in areas that I'm more familiar with, such as, you know, cognitive science, you know, is pushing back against a kind of computationalist or representationalist account that you might find in, you know, Fodor or, you know, Churchland's or whoever. But you can say the same about accounts at the cellular level. You can say the same about accounts at the social level and all of those sorts of things. And so your account is, in a certain sense, a kind of a homogenizing sort of thing, but there's this other world, as it were, that is being supplanted by that. And I'm interested in the ways in which that world is pushing back. You know, we have different kinds of you know, versions of representationalism in cognitive science that are trying to reassert themselves. We have, you know, different kinds of mechanistic thinking and so forth. And I wonder if part of the reason for that is that it's a battle over what can, as it were, control the future. In other words, what can explain things so that we can move into the future, so that we can make decisions in order to, you know, be able to act into the future. So I'm just interested in your reaction to that, because, you know, there is that other world that is behind what you've just discussed here.
Yeah, these questions are absolutely fantastic. So I think everybody's, you know, to your point, Bruce, and Duarte and Andrea, what you brought up is this is what Lasse and I have noticed in doing these interviews with these 50 odd individuals involved in complexity, is all the things you're bringing up are exactly the things that they have brought up. We have these brilliant conversations. Now the problem is we got to get onto the writing, which is a bit of a challenge, but it has been incredible. There, I think, to your question, Bruce, there is a sea change happening. The question for me is, I've always thought of the stuff that I'm presenting, whatever you want to call it, social complexity, the study of social complexity, was always meant to be transdisciplinary. It's not right. It's not necessarily, it's not a discipline. It's not a, you know, it's a transdisciplinary sort of project or a form of inquiry. So what Lasse and I are interested in the book is the pushback against that. And to your point, the way in which, you know, it was Pinker and modularity and all that stuff, and then Fodor and the notions of computational. And then what's been really fascinating is the way complexity is actually presently being undermined by computational science. I mean, I'm regularly in these sorts of workshops and stuff where somebody is an evolutionary biologist. They build an agent-based model of Instagram activity around, you know, global warming. They know nothing, or actually, let's go back. I was involved in COVID-19 modeling and dealing with lots of colleagues that knew nothing about the infectious disease process. They actually didn't understand how that worked, but they were very good at building agent-based models, right? Because they did it for the universe or for galaxies and stuff. So I absolutely agree with you that one of the massive challenges is how do you, and I think that was kind of maybe one of the reasons I even did what I did today, which was to intentionally just blur across so many boundaries and just intentionally, you know, just sort of push it, that this, you know, all this stuff sort of coming at you, because it really, to your point, is about how do you get into that headspace that, now I think at the end of the day, I would say I'm very much a critical or complex realist, in the sense that I think your point also that no one model is ever going to get this all right. You know, even like the way Andrea brought up, she's like, where's the emotion? And it's like, yeah, I didn't do a very good job on that, right? I mean, there's always going to be the ends of a model that you go, well, that was really cool, Brian, but you missed this, or you need this. So I think at some level, transdisciplinary ideas don't mean that old school, like kind of systems thinking where, you know, they were Miller's working on, we're going to build a living system, everything, and stitch it all up. It's kind of pointless. I don't know, does that kind of get at your question, or sort of what you're thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. I was really just looking, you know, to give you an opening to talk more about that than, you know, nail something down here. But, you know, I think you're absolutely right. There is a, you know, attempts to fix up those sorts of models, and we'll never get a one model as a complete, you know, picture. And maybe that's kind of part of the point. What I'm worried about is if complexity simply takes over the old aspirations of you know, more mechanistic thinking, which is to control the future, right? Mm-hmm. So what if we give up that aspiration? What if we think about something differently? Then, you know, now we know how things really work, and now we can control the future.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And if you think back to sort of like the 80s and well, let's go more early 90s, and sort of the stuff, the initial books that came out, like Paul Cillier's work, David Byrne's work, that, you know, they were looking at the relationship between complexity and postmodernism and post-structuralism and feminism and feminist critiques of science and philosophy of science, and really, you know, emerging out of a sort of a frame of there are limitations to what science can do, right? And that's sort of, to your point, has gotten lost. Right now, it's just complexity can do everything. I don't think it can. It's certainly the newest trick around. It's certainly interesting and neat, but there's going to probably be anti-complexity movement in 50 years, back to localism and small models, small science. I mean, there'll be this movement, and one day they'll read the work that we've all done and be like, geez, they were just so misinformed. So yeah, I think that will definitely play.
Gary, you had a question about collective psychology that Brian spoke about. Do you want to come online?
Yeah, thanks, Brian, and great to meet you. And that map that you update on a regular basis is just absolutely awe-inspiring. How you manage to get insight into all those theorists, is a book in itself. So, I mean, that's a fantastic tool for everyone else in the field. So thank you for that. I was just interested in your ideas on this, the sort of collective psychology, the level of existence beyond the individual, how it linked into Jung's sort of collective unconscious idea, but more so, when you looked at that initial definition, it looked like it was more the moments that humans come together where this psychology exists. But I have a sense that this is a living system in itself beyond the individual, and whether there's thought that's taken place around that.
Yeah, I think that's again an excellent question. Yeah, I think it's sort of, you go back to the work of Durkheim in sociology and this idea of a social fact and that society exists independent of individuals. And I think that's just always been a challenge, right, for the human mind. They can somehow, like when I say to people, well, you realize your brain, you're just inhabiting a body that's got all these different levels of cognition and consciousness, and the cells in your feet don't really care about you. They don't really care if you're having pizza today or having a cappuccino or whatever. They're just doing what they do down there in the foot. And I press on people to realize, they just assume, right, well, we're walking flesh and blood human beings, so therefore we're this living system. But then, like you say, when you go to group dynamics or go to these larger networks, suddenly they just can't grasp that. They're like, this idea that there is no society, there is no, but I absolutely agree with you. I think, and you see that even in that, American Psychological Association's definition of collective psychology. It's just the aggregate behavior of a bunch of individuals. There's nothing really else there. And I remember, to your point, when I having moved from psychology to sociology, and it took me a really long time at an existential level to realize what the sociologists were saying, because I kept going, yeah, aggregate behavior, yeah, I get it. But they're like, no, Brian, you really don't. And I had a professor, Denny Benson, who taught social psychology. And the first lecture was the difference between psychological social psychology and sociological social psychology. And the way he said it, to your point, was psychological social psychology has the individual at the center and then tries to understand the social influences. Sociological psychology starts with two people in a room interacting, that idea that, and then you put the third person in and the fourth, and what happens in the larger emergent phenomenon that's there, and the way that real structures, exist, the larger histories into which we're born. So yeah, I absolutely agree with you. It may not have been quite as stated in what I was outlining, but absolutely, these are living systems, and they need to be studied as their own.
Thank you. I'm conscious that we're coming close up on time, so I think we'll take one more question and then we'll call it a day. Is there anybody else who'd like to jump in there? Okay, I'll save the final question for myself.
Moderator's privilege.
Moderator's privilege, indeed. I wanted to ask you about what you raised around the global civil society and sort of the conflagration between globalization and global civil society. And what do you think the global civil society is doing wrong or should be doing in order to sort of untangle that? because given climate change, given things like the COVID pandemic, there is only really one body or system that we have on Earth that can deal with those things, and that is global civil society. So it's not something we can just sort of cast away. But obviously, as you correctly pointed out, there's all this suspicion, critique against these organizations. What do they need to do to kind of undo that tangle?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, which I'll try to answer in 30 seconds or less. So it's a brilliant question. And I think we could, literally have a seminar series just on that. So I hope my answer isn't mistaken for its simplicity, just responding. I think two things. I think a field like climate psychology is a good field to take a look at in terms of going to Andrea's point about emotions and meeting people where they're at and dealing with fear, dealing with anger, dealing with resentment, dealing with what is emotionally keeping people from sort of taking that step forward. Like my family are all Italian and Slovakian immigrants to the States from the early 1900s. My grandparents worked in the coal mines, and they're out of jobs. They have no work. The area is economically depressed. The sort of Scranton, East Coast. My family's New York City area, as Anton knows. And you went from a thriving area to an area that is economically depressed. They're desperate for work. Globalization is what's been blamed or explained to them as the culprit, but then it's conflated with science and elites and organized on purpose in certain ways. And dealing with that, I think you see, as an example, I mean, I can't speak to every country in the world. I can speak to the countries I live in, the UK and the United States, with a degree of sophistication. But you see someone like Biden focused on working America, and that starts to change people, right? When you're getting people their vaccination, you're getting food, as Duarte was talking about, food security and job security. As you establish those things for people, you're dealing directly with what they're most afraid of, what they're most angry about. And when you deal with racism and you deal with the ugly ways in which discrimination emerges in the States, and you start to demonstrate that you're actually passing laws like the anti-Asian issue in the States and the passing of that by Congress yesterday, those things that they address people's emotions and the things that they're most worried about and concerned about. And I think that helps to bring people around. And so I think that kind of approach is what is more needed, but it's very difficult because people tend to just focus on, I think, the differences. And I think that's where a sort of pragmatist view comes in, that we're less concerned with what people think and more concerned with how they behave. And sort of, that equifinality that you and I can both save somebody drowning in a river. We don't have to be of the same political opinion. We both just need to jump in the water and save them. So trying to get past that type of ideological politics, which I think links to sort of the identity politics that you see going on today, that, people have come to this place where they're just of, I mean, I know I'm sort of blabbing on, but, I was in a lecture recently where the keynote speaker was speaking, and one of the people just said, "You're wrong. You're just wrong." And he responded by going, what you're saying is, there is not a word, not a single word that came out of my mouth that was right. It is just all absolutely wrong. And everybody started laughing, and it's sort of like, okay, come on. I may be wrong on a lot of things, but that doesn't mean that I don't have some things that are right. So I think kind of trying to deal with that identity politics is massive, but these are not easy things, right? By any stretch of the imagination. So I think it's a big challenge, but to your point, which goes to your research as well, as time is running out. We really don't have the luxury of time, as we've seen this past year with COVID. We don't have the luxury to sort of work these things out over decades. They need to be solved in a matter of months oftentimes, which presents tremendous challenges to science. I don't think scientists were trained to work that way at that level of speed. So these become difficult. And I think the last thing I'll say is politicians doing a better job of working with experts, such as all of ourselves here today, and and how do you bridge that gap around policy, I think is something very new for government to get better at.
Excellent. Some wonderful reflections and insights there. I think we'll call it for today. Thank you so much, Brian, for your time. This is amazing. I'll certainly have to go and watch this 3 or 4 more times to kind of get all the reference material out of it. I can see some things will certainly feed into my PhD. But thank you so much. Yeah, if you just want to switch on your cameras and wave goodbye, we'll say.
Thank you as well. Thank you, Andrea and Anton, for the opportunity. It was really nice. Paul Cilio's work was a huge influence on me early on. I still remember back in 1998, I was sitting in a meeting, right? My department head goes, "What are you reading? What's it, postmodernism? And what the heck is that?" And I was like, "Well, it's this really cool book." And he actually bought it and read it, And so, the opportunity to present today was much appreciated. So thank you.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
yes,
thanks so
thank
much.
you. Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
Thanks,
Yes, and thank you everyone for joining us. I'm trying to make the window bigger so that we can see you say goodbye. I hope that it will record and not just record my big face here. But yes, thank you very much, Brian. It was massive, and I agree with Anton. Yeah, another 10 or 20 viewings. Get us to the point where we can
hopefully hopefully once COVID goes, maybe I can actually visit in person. That would be kind of cool.
That would be fabulous.
Yeah,
yes. Okay. We're recording that. We've pulled
it. I love to travel.
That's a definite. Okay,
this,
you're invited. You've accepted. We'll make it happen.
Great.
All right.
Take care, everybody. Cheers.
All right. Thanks so much.
Bye.
And yeah, see you all next week. It will be Bruce next week, as a matter of interest. I've heard a lot from him in bits and pieces. Very eager to hear a full presentation from you. So yes. Okay.
Look forward to it.
All right.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.